Carol has already asked you about the brief information about the activities and the community. So this time we want some questions a little bit personal. For example, like when did you come to the MCMC?
Oh, wow, okay. Personal question. So do you want to know about my career, my work history, or just here?
No, just here.
Ah, okay.
In your first impression about Mary Creek?
Management committee or the creek?
The creek.
Ah, the creek itself. Well, I've actually had a very long association with the creek. I've worked around and volunteered around the creek for about 15 years. But I've only worked here at Mary Creek Management Committee for the past 3 years, off and on. So my initial impressions of the creek, I guess a typical urban creek, a lot of problems, high turbidity, muddiness, lots of litter in the creek. Some habitat values weren't very good. So when I mean habitat, I'm talking about there wasn't a lot of understory of vegetation along the creek, a lot of weeds, a lot of erosion. So I guess an urban creek with a lot of problems. But then there's also been lots of great work that's happened as well. So lots of people have been planting trees and removing the litter. So I guess there's also a lot of community support here that you don't see on other urban creeks that I'm associated with. So for example, I live near the Moonee Ponds Creek, and there is a community group that's interested in it, but not as large a groundswell of community. So I guess that's the big difference here. The Mary Creek here is the whole catchment, and particularly this area, is very well loved by the local people, and people really want to do things to improve how it looks, but also for habitat values for local plants and animals that are here.
So which part of the creek is like the worst pollution or the worst situation?
Well, the thing is, a creek you can't separate it into little sections. It's a living system, so it's currently moving. So that's a bit difficult to answer because it's an 80-kilometre creek, and this isn't in all of it. So any water that's upstream is eventually going to move downstream. So if there's pollution upstream, it's going to come down anyway.
Yes.
But if you're talking about, I guess, where most of the pollution comes from, is that what you're sort of asking?
Yeah.
So I guess the worst areas, I guess, are where there's a lot of housing. So a lot of the pollution comes from urban stormwater. So stormwater drains. So the more built up an area is, and the more unaware, or I guess where people don't care really, is where there's more pollution, because people aren't thinking about their behaviours. So behaviours like washing your car on the side of the road, industry, so people that might have a large factory that aren't making sure that if they have a spill that they're containing it, those kinds of things are where you get more pollution. But then there's an incident. So for example, there's been fires further upstream the creek, and they've been using fire water, so foam and things to stop the fire, and then that's been getting into the creek. So then you have an issue there. So it changes all the time. So it depends on if there's a pollution spill, I guess, is the short answer to your question. Generally the creeks are quite poor in water quality, and that's because there's constantly different things happening. So the water quality generally is poor everywhere, and then sometimes gets extreme worse in other areas if there's pollution spills, and that's just because people's behaviours are influencing the creek.
I asked you this question because we went to the creek for a little travel.
Oh yeah, which part?
We went from this
in
this part,
yeah.
And we took some pictures, and when we posted, our teacher just said it looks really stunning, and it looks clean and beautiful. It doesn't look like polluted. But our topic is like the creek is has some serious water pollution. So
it does. The thing is that looks can be deceiving. So some days it looks really nice, but you're only looking at one factor. You're looking at what we call turbidity, the clarity of the water. So some days the water looks nice and clear, but that's just one factor. You haven't tested the pH, you haven't looked at the salinity, you haven't looked at the nutrients, you haven't looked at the oxygen levels, you haven't looked at are there any heavy metals. So when you've got all of those factors involved, the creek is actually polluted. So a lot of it is what you can't see. So I think that's the thing, people look at the creek and think, oh, it's really clean. And you know, and that day it might not be muddy that day, particularly if you haven't had rain. But if you look on our website, the front page, about 3 months ago, the creek was all muddy. And it was because there were some pollution incidences happening further upstream. So I think I did refer that web link to Carol.
Yeah.
So you've got that information. So it changes from day to day. That some days it can look really nice and clean, and other days it can be really polluted. It just depends on what's happening in the system. Yeah. So looks can be deceiving. Yeah.
So do you participate in every activities in person?
Oh no. Gosh, I'd have no life.
So have you?
So do you mean, so your question is,
have you been in those activities? I mean, like taking students to the
yes.
place?
So sorry, activities is a very broad term. So there's
yeah,
a very
you have different kinds of activities.
yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
So we want to know, is there anything that impressed you most in those activities? Like,
Do you mean that I run or the community does? Because you see, you've got the Friends of Merri Creek that run
Yeah.
their own activities. Then you've got us staff here, Merri Creek Management Committee, that also run activities for schools and community.
Yeah.
And then you just got people off their own bat, their residents, and they just go and run their own activities.
Yeah, I mean, just like the activities organized by your committee. I mean, if you participate in and you take students, is there anything, their actions or their behaviors or some views, something that impress you?
Okay, so I'll give you an example, I guess. So I work with lots of school groups, and I think, for example, there was a local school that, and this, I wasn't involved in this project, they went along the creek and they were really disturbed by the amount of litter they saw and the pollution. So they actually came up, and part of their studies when you're in upper primary is something called project-based learning. So they had to invent something, and they invented different machinery to actually remove the pollution from the creek. And then they actually had an open day, and I was invited and other people were invited to have a look. So that was pretty impressive. I'm also impressed with students when I go in and talk about the creek and the problems it has, and then we always talk about solutions and actions, and some of the students come up with some really interesting actions, like what we can do to improve the creek. So
Yeah.
there's lots of things about filtering the water, there's things about educating other people, so talking to their schoolmates, I guess, and talking to their parents. I think the big thing is a lot of them don't go to the creek, and so then they want to be more involved in the creek, and they might join the local friends group and come out and plant trees or remove litter. So I guess I'm impressed with students that then follow through, that keep thinking about it and then perhaps take some action. That's probably, there's lots of examples of things that students have done, and not just students but young people. For example, I had a young person, well, probably around your age, that organised a litter clean-up just on Facebook, and about between 50 to 70 people came just one morning, and they removed I think it was a tonne of litter, just one morning. And it was all people, pretty much nearly everyone was under 25. So I think that's really impressive to see that young people are really concerned about the creek and are prepared to come out on their weekend and get a bit dirty, because it's not fun.
Yeah.
Picking up litter is not glamorous, but they could see that as soon as they'd removed the litter, how much better the creek looked. And of course, plastics is a really big issue. So a lot of us are knowing more about plastic, and that I think it's by 2050 they think that there's going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish. So that's really concerning,
Yeah.
and it concerns a lot of people here, and people here are doing something about it by not just picking up litter but trying to educate others about not using plastic bags. And you see here, like we're recycling all these bags, they go to Red Cycle, so even soft plastics, we try and find different ways, do more than just the standard, and I think that's the thing around the community here. They're not just reusing a bag, for example, or composting. They're trying to think of even bigger ways to improve the creek. Yeah.
Education program. 比如说
Do you want to know more about the education program? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
So-
our story will focus on like the education and children and the Merri Creek.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So we run a number of education programs. So we do early learning. So we do from childcare kindergarten centres. We also run something called Nature Play. So kids that age, you're more focused on getting them connected to a local bush, because little kids don't always go out into the bush. So they could be, actually usually their parents are frightened of the bush, and kids then aren't used to being outside. So it's more about getting them outside. Skills in the bush, really, like knowing where to walk, watching out for long grass because there might be snakes. So it can be as simple as that. Or it could be when you're walking through the bush, make sure you hold the stick so that it doesn't flick in the next person's face. So there's those kind of little bush skills.
Yeah.
And then there's going, oh, smell that. Oh, that's a gum leaf. Gum leaves are from Australia. This is a local plant. What lives in the local plant? Oh, koalas might live here. So we have to make sure that we keep these plants because animals need them. And don't you like the animals? Yes, I like the animals. Well, we have to keep this bush here. It's important. So you're really at that level. But when you go up into primary and secondary, you can cover much more complex, things. So that's when we might talk about, we've got on there food webs. We might talk about the pollution and its impacts, and how the pollution got there. We would do water testing, so more chemistry, physics as well. We look at how fast the water moves. So it's more about embedding it in the curriculum, but I guess we're trying to get the message across that we all need to look after these creeks, and this is what's going on in the creek. This is how you're improving students' knowledge, but we're also trying to, our other kind of prong, is, you kind of have a three or four prong approach. You kind of got curriculum, building knowledge, building skills, but also you want them to take action, which might be planting trees or removing litter, but even more importantly, you want them to not contribute to what's happening. So the next generation is not going to do the same behaviours that my generation have done, where they don't care, they'll smoke and just flick that on the road, or they'll wash their car on the street and don't care that the foam is going down the drain and ending up in the creek, or so yeah, that's sort of what we focus on. They're those focus areas, and then tertiary is even more complex. Is that sort of what you want to know? Is that
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And do you have like some future program on educational?
Constantly. So we're a not-for-profit, so we don't just get given money. We have to get money from different sources. So councils pay us, and the Water Board, Melbourne Water, but that money could go anytime. So we're constantly on the lookout for new innovative ways to keep our education program going. So the main way is grants. So we need to get grants, philanthropic associations. So depending on where that money's coming from, we will sort of adapt. So we are constantly changing, and things are always changing. So for example, I haven't been here for 10 years, but Angela, my colleague, has been here for 15 years. 15 years ago, we didn't talk about plastic. Microplastic, nurdles, these types of things are really concerning for all of us. So we now have programs around plastic. We have citizen science projects like around frogs. So we have something called Frogs Census. So frogs are an indication of pollution, so they're a really good bioindicator. So we now have an app called Frog Census, and we go out and record data on where frog populations are, because that can tell us also how healthy or polluted a creek is. So we go and do those kinds of things. We didn't do that 10, 15 years ago. So it's constantly evolving with research that's done where you guys are at university. We learn new things. So it's very important for us as staff here to go along to lectures and keep studying ourselves, so we know what's the important issues are out there, and we then build programs around that with teachers. So we're working. So I've got a Master of Teaching background, so I've got quite a good knowledge of curriculum. So we want to match it with curriculum. Otherwise, teachers won't have us in their classrooms because they're like, sorry, what you're doing is lovely, but it won't fit in with our needs. So we've got to match it with curriculum needs, but we also want teachers and students to know, well, these are the major problems. So for example, on the Mary Creek, habitat loss in some areas is not as big a problem because we put lots of plants back, but pollution is still the issue. So if we only had a certain amount of time with a teacher, we might focus on plastics in the creek rather than tree hollows or something, for example. So we kind of always changing, innovating, depending on what current research is telling us is the major problems. Yeah.
That's good.
Do you have something to say, maybe like to the future generations, like to the Mary Creek 10 years or 20 years later? I mean something like a hope, a wish, or something that we can use at the ending.
Yeah.
I mean, something like say
How
to
I'd
the
like it to
future.
look. What I envisage the creek, how I hope it will look.
Yeah.
That's a really, really good question. My hope, and it always has been ever since I started working in environmental education 20 years ago, is that we could drink the water and swim in the creek. So, many years ago when the Wurundjeri people were the main custodians, I mean, they are still the custodians of this land, but when they were the main people here, they would swim and fish and live and drink by the Mary Creek. It was a very, very important creek for them. Yeah. Whereas now, I mean, things have changed. We've obviously got lots of new people coming in, but you can't, I mean, people walk their dog along the creek now and they wouldn't even want their dog to go in the water some days or drink the water. And to think, gee, I think it might have been maybe 80 years ago now, people were swimming and drinking the water, and we can't do that anymore. Like, it's not safe. So I guess that's one of my hopes, is that we could one day, if you're hot and you're down here, you could go swimming in the creek, or you could
really
drink the water.
nice.
Wouldn't that be nice? But isn't that simple? Like, shouldn't we be able to go out in nature and it be safe, and we should go out and feel comfortable and safe and happy, and I think some of those things we do already, but the thing is, we're destroying the thing that is looking after us. We're destroying the creek. Because we don't think about it so much, a lot of people don't think about the creek, it's slowly deteriorating, whereas it should be the other way around, that we love the creek, so the creek should love us back. It should be a mutual relationship, and it's not at the moment. We're taking and we're not giving. So I guess that's I would love that to be in 20 years' time, when I'm probably close to retirement and I'm a doddering old woman, that I can walk down to the creek and take my cup and sip the water.
Yeah. And you can tell your grandson about the story of Mary Creek.
Yeah,
Really
exactly.
nice.
And maybe show them pictures of how yucky it used to be, and he would say, "Oh, this looks so terrible. How did you live like this?" And it would be a strange concept to have pollution. That would be my dream.
That's nice. Thank you so much. That's really nice.